I'm Ivan V. Let's talk about component isolation. Component isolation allows developers to have a cleaner, reusable, and scalable architecture for dealing with individual UI components rather than dealing with the application as a whole. Component isolation also allows us to have easier UI testing by not having to worry about the state management and logic attached to the UI elements. But what exactly does a component isolated package look like in the rest of the project architecture? Well, this usually means simply creating a new Flutter project that uses our component isolated package. The component package is essentially functioning as UI layer, which is made up of the UI code and some base logic and state management that's needed to make the UI work. However, the component package should not contain any of the actual application logic, such as communication with an API. Instead, the Flutter package that's using the component package should be in charge of providing that logic. When it comes to building with Parabeac, we will first generate a package containing the static UI. Then, we will add some base BLoC and logic. Finally, we will import this package into our actual Flutter app, where we overwrite the logic from the package by extending the blocks we create. Let's get started. The first thing we need to do is set up our Figma file. As you can see here, I have a food cart component that I want to have as my component isolated package. The first step we need to take is to label each component or each element inside Figma that needs logic as custom. In my case, it'll be the minus button, the plus button, and the number in between. The idea here is that when I click the minus or plus button, the quantity of the item will decrease or increase. So as you can see here, I've labeled this as plus button custom, minus button custom, and item quantity custom. What that will do is it'll allow Parabeac to detect that we want to add some logic in these components, and will make it easy for me to insert the BLoC and state management logic. So now that our Figma file is ready, we can go ahead and convert it using Parabeac Nest. As you can see, I've gone to app.parabeac.com and I've already signed in. From here, we can go ahead and select our team and start our new project. I'll name this one Food App Comps. In the next step, we can go ahead and enter our Figma personal access token and paste our Figma URL that we want to convert. So go ahead and do that and click next. From here, we'll see all the pages that Parabeac detected. We can see it's only one, which is the food cart. And if we go back to the Figma file, we see that there is only one component called food cart. So I'll go ahead and hit apply. And in here, I'll go ahead and select my GitHub repository that I want to merge into, which is food app comps, and select the main branch and then hit submit. So after a few moments, we'll have our code converted and our pull request done. Once you see this message, your pull request has been successful. So now you can go ahead and click on the link here and go to our pull requests, and we'll see that we'll have a newly generated pull request here. So I'll just go ahead and merge in that pull request into my main branch, and we're good to go. So now in the next step, I'll show you how to set up your environment using VS Code to clone your repo. After merging the pull request, we can go ahead and copy the GitHub link, open up a new terminal, and I'll go ahead and create a new directory for our workspace here and cd into it. And then I'll go ahead and open it in Visual Studio Code. So from here, I'll go ahead and clone our repo from the terminal using the git clone command. And paste our link here, and we'll see that the repo was successfully cloned with the Flutter project. Another thing we want to do is create a new project. I'll call it Food App, and this will be the actual app that uses our component isolated package. So once we have these two packages set up, we're ready to move on to the next step, which would be to add BLoC state management to our component isolated package. So before we actually begin editing our workspace, I highly recommend that you get the BLoC extension from Visual Studio Code. After that, you may notice some red lines here. All I have to do is cd into our food app components library and do a Flutter pub get. In addition, we'll also need to add, using Flutter pub add Flutter BLoC and hit enter. And we should get those dependencies in. So after we've set that up, we can go ahead and right click on the lib folder and create a new block. And I'll go ahead and call it base food item and hit enter. And we can see that it automatically generated these three files, the BLoC, event, and state. So we can go ahead and work with the event first. We'll want to override most of this code actually. So we'll go ahead and remove this. And the only thing we actually want to add to this is an integer of number of items and actually create the initializer. We can make this optional. And if the developer does not specify it, we can just automatically initialize it to 0. So that's all we want to do for the state. Next up is the event. So for the event, we actually want to create two separate events, one for when we increase the number of items and one for when we decrease the number of items. So let's go ahead and do that. So add a food item, and we should extend the base food item event. And let's go ahead and paste another one that's very similar. And we can go ahead and rename it to remove food item. And that's all we want to do to this event. And finally, the BLoC here. There's an error because we removed the food item initial state. So we can go ahead and change it to the base food item state. And if we want to, we can initialize it, but I'll go ahead and leave it empty because we already took care of that. Next up for the BLoC is we actually want to create two methods. One that handles on add item, and the other one handles on remove item. So I'll go ahead and add the boilerplate here would be that it takes in a add food item event, and it also takes in an emitter. Same thing down here. We'll have a remove food item event and an emitter. Okay, next up we need to register it in the initializer. We can do that by typing on add food item. We can simply call on add item. And similar, we can do the same with on remove item. Simply replace the add for remove. And there we go. And since this is our component isolated package, we don't actually want to have any important logic here. The reason why is because this will let us easily test that the right methods are being called with the right events. So we can go ahead and just add a print statement here that says on add item, and then same thing here. We can just add a print statement that says on remove item. And we are good to go. So now that we've set up the BLoC, in the next step, I'll show you how to add a BLoC provider that you can use to interact with your app. That way the states are actually being called. Actually, before we proceed, let's go ahead and clear this boilerplate right here. And change this emitter to the name emit as is convention. And now we're good to go. So if you may recall, we want to add the BLoC logic in 3 different places: the minus button, the plus button, and the actual number that displays how many items we have selected. So if you followed along with the tutorial, and added custom to those widgets, you should see this folder called controller tag in your directory. So it contains 3 files: item quantity custom, minus button custom, and plus button custom. So if we go ahead and click on one of these, we'll see that it's just boilerplate for a stateful widget that returns widget.child. So widget.child just represents the UI that exists in Figma, and we can do anything we want with this class, and it will not get overridden in further generation of your Figma. So let's go ahead and wrap this widget.child with a gesture detector. And let me go ahead and import the Flutter BLoC. Okay, and let's add a function on tap right here that calls context.read, and then the type is food item BLoC .add, and then here we have to add our event. In this case, we want to do an add food item event, and there we go. This will send the add food item event to the nearest block that the context finds. So we want to do something pretty similar to the remove or minus button. So I'll go ahead and paste this and go to minus button, remove the old code, and add. Oops, let's see if we didn't copy it. Go ahead and copy this and paste it over here, and just change this for remove food item, and let's not forget to import our BLoC, and finally import our Flutter BLoC. Awesome. So next is the item quantity. So in here we actually want to disregard the widget.child entirely, and we want to return our own text right here. Once again, let's go ahead and import the Flutter BLoC. And in here, what we actually want to do is called context.watch, which will provide continuous changes from our BLoC. And let's go ahead and do this. And then we actually want to read the state dot the number of items. And then we can just call a toString method. And there we go. So what this does is that it continually looks at the base food item block, looks at its state, and then reads the number of items. So if the number of items is updated in the block, this widget will detect it and display it in the text. So in the next step, we can go ahead and run the code and see how it actually interacts with our block. In order to run our app, let's go into the main.dart file. Here, we want to override the home property. So let's go ahead and change that. And we actually want to create a scaffold here with the body property. So in the body property, we want to create a block provider that creates, using context, creates a food item block, base food item block. And we'll also give it the child property, and we'll give it a sized box. The reason we want to do this is because we want to actually have some constraints. So as a width, I'll go ahead and give it 500, and as a height, I'll give it 100. And then the child of this size box will be a layout builder, which returns the food cart. And the reason we do this is because food cart actually takes in the constraints, so it can resize itself based on the parent component. So in this case, the size box will be applying those constraints. Let's go ahead and remove this trailing extra comma, and we can start running our app in web. So let's just give it a few minutes while that loads. Awesome. So as we can see, we have our app loaded. And we can actually see that because we created this block provider and initialized the food item block, if we go ahead and click on these buttons, we'll see the console printing out on remove item. And then if we tap the plus, we will have on add item. Keep in mind that the actual number will not update because we are not actually updating that number. So that will stay at 0. So in the next step, I'll actually go ahead and show you how to simulate running it through an actual app where you can edit the logic and have the number changing. So before we go ahead and do that, I will add all my changes into Git, commit them, and push them, which will be important in the next step. After committing and pushing all our changes to the component package, we can go ahead and open our food app and go into the pubspec.yaml, and under dependencies we'll actually want to add our component package called food app comps. And here we can actually specify that we want to add it via Git. So I'll go ahead and copy the GitHub link and paste it here. So go ahead and save it, and it should automatically pull those dependencies. And it looks like it worked. So now let's cd into our food app, and we also need to add the Flutter block. Awesome. So it added Flutter block as a dependency. Next, the next thing we need to do is actually use the package. So we can do the same thing we did in the food app comps. We can actually copy this code right here and paste it into the other main to replace this. And after that, we will go ahead and add all the necessary imports. We can easily import packages from our new library. So let's go ahead and save that. And now we'll be able to run it. However, this will just yield the same result where every time you click on the buttons, it just prints out to the console. So next up, we'll actually set up a block that will sort of override the one from our package and actually add our custom logic in there that will actually increase or decrease the number of items that are selected for that card. In order to add logic to our app, let's go in the lib folder and create a new block directory. And here, let's create a new file called foodapp.block.dart. So let's go ahead and create the block here using the snippet and just call it foodapp.block. Let's go ahead and import that. And then here, instead of extending block, let's go ahead and import our base food item block. And here we can actually completely remove this food app initial since the base block already takes care of that. Now down here, let's override our onAddItem function as well as the onRemoveItem function. Awesome. So actually this boilerplate we can also remove since the base block is also taking care of that. So over here, instead of just printing, let's go and emit a new state. So let's add the base food item state, where the number of items is going to be the previous state plus 1. And then on remove item, we can also go ahead and remove this boilerplate. We want to do basically the same thing as on add item, where we create a new base food item state, and the new number of items is going to be the old number of items minus 1. And then as added safety, we can add an if statement that checks if we have a state bigger than 0. Let's move it up here. And so what this will do is it will not allow us to have any number less than 0 in our state. So if we go back to the main.dart, let's specify that we want a base food item block. And here, let's change this to be our overridden food app block. Awesome. So let's go ahead and save that, and we can run our app. So here it looks like the app has started and it rendered correctly. So let's actually go ahead and test out the buttons. So we can see here that when I tap the plus button, the number changes, and if I tap the minus, it decreases the number, but will not let us go beyond 0 in the negative direction. So what is actually happening here is that in main, we're declaring a base food item block, but we're actually feeding it a food app block. So here, the methods that are actually going to get called are the overridden ones that actually emit the state. So over here in our controller, in the item quantity, since we're watching the value, this value will continuously get updated in our UI automatically. So what we've done here so far is create a component isolated package and implemented a application that imports that package and actually overrides some of the state management logic that it contains. So I hope this tutorial has been helpful. Thank you.